The city of New York never really sleeps. Its streets are always alive. Taxi horns echoing through avenues, streetlights flickering against tall glass towers, and people rushing as if time itself was chasing them. In a place where wealth and poverty walk side by side, few ever stop to notice the quiet souls who blend into the crowd, hiding stories that could change everything. And in this very city lived a young man named David Carter. To most who passed him on the street, David seemed ordinary. He lived in a modest apartment, wore simple clothes, and worked jobs that never seemed to match his quiet confidence. If you looked closely, though, you'd notice there was something different about him, something that couldn't be explained by appearances alone, because David carried a secret. Behind those humble clothes and that calm smile was a man who was far from ordinary. David was, in truth, a billionaire, one of the youngest and wealthiest business minds in the state. His name was hidden behind powerful companies, silent investments, and countless contracts that never carried his face. To the public eye, his empire didn't even exist. Why hide such wealth? Why live as though he owned nothing, when in reality he could buy half the city with a single phone call? The answer was simple. David wanted something money could never buy: love that was real. He had seen enough of the world to know the way people changed when they discovered a man's worth. Suddenly, every smile carried an expectation. Every relationship came with a price. And David, though rich beyond measure, longed for something different. He wanted someone who could see him, not the billions in his name, not the power he carried in silence, but him. It was during one ordinary evening, at a charity event he had quietly funded but never took credit for, that David first saw Emily Whitmore. Emily was nothing like the circles he secretly belonged to. She wasn't chasing headlines or flaunting wealth. She carried herself with a quiet elegance, her laughter soft but genuine, her kindness shining in the way she spoke to everyone, whether it was a wealthy donor or a server passing drinks. She was the kind of woman who didn't need a stage to command attention. For David, it was instant. Something in her presence pulled him in, something deeper than appearance. And though Emily came from a wealthy family herself, he could sense she was not as close to them as most would expect. There was distance in her smile whenever they were mentioned, a shadow of pressure that lingered in her eyes. That night, David made a choice. He wouldn't tell her who he really was. He wouldn't flash his wealth, wouldn't let his empire stand between them. He would approach her as the man he appeared to be, ordinary, simple, unremarkable. And to his quiet surprise, Emily saw him. Where so many others looked past him, Emily noticed the way he listened, the thoughtfulness in his words. They spoke for hours, the noise of the event fading until it felt like the room had only the two of them. In the days that followed, David and Emily met again and again. Coffee shops, quiet walks in Central Park, long conversations that stretched into the night. And though David offered her no stories of riches or power, she still chose to be there. She laughed with him, shared her dreams, and for the first time in his life, David felt what he had been searching for all along: love without price. But love is never simple. Emily's family, the Whitmores, were among New York's proudest and wealthiest families. Their name carried weight, their gatherings filled with senators, CEOs, and heirs to fortunes. To them, image was everything. And when Emily began to bring David into her world, the smiles faded. Whispers began. A quiet storm started to gather. Because to them, David was nothing. A nobody. A man with no status, no family legacy, and worst of all, a man whose skin, in their eyes, did not belong beside theirs. Emily, however, did not care. She stood beside him, and when David asked for her hand, she said yes. Against her family's expectations, against the warnings and the whispers, she chose love. The wedding was small. The Whitmores attended, but their presence was cold, their blessings half-hearted. And though David smiled through it all, though he held Emily's hand tightly as vows were exchanged, he knew in his heart that this marriage would not be a quiet one. Because some storms don't stay silent forever. And in the Whitmore family, resentment was only just beginning. Marriage should be the beginning of joy, a promise of new beginnings, shared dreams, and two lives intertwined into one. But for David and Emily, their marriage was not met with celebration. It was met with suspicion, whispers, and silent scorn. From the moment David walked into the Whitmore family's grand estate as their new son-in-law, he was measured and judged. The Whitmores were a family of reputation. Old money, old power, and older pride. And in their eyes, David was an outsider. He didn't come from wealth, or so they believed. He didn't belong to any of the social circles they valued. And most of all, he was black. Something the Whitmores never said aloud, but it lived in the silence of their glances, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the cold politeness that dripped with quiet disapproval. At dinners, David was often seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, as if to remind him of his place. When he spoke, his words were ignored, brushed aside, or answered with faint smiles that carried no warmth. Servants were treated with more respect than he was. And yet, through it all, David stayed calm. He carried himself with quiet dignity, never raising his voice, never letting his pride break. For he knew who he truly was, and he knew why he was there. Not for their approval, not for their wealth, but for Emily. Emily, however, was torn. At first, she defended him. Whenever her mother's remarks turned sharp, whenever her cousins made sly jokes, she spoke up. She held David's hand tightly at family gatherings, as if her grip could shield him from their disdain. But over time, the endless remarks began to weigh on her. "You could have had anyone, Emily," her relatives would say. "Why him? What does he even do? He's nothing." The repetition was poison, and though Emily loved David deeply, she began to falter. She looked at him sometimes and wondered, had she chosen wrong? It wasn't because she stopped loving him, but because love, under the crushing weight of family, begins to bend. Doubt seeps in like water through cracks, and no heart, no matter how strong, is immune. David saw this change in her eyes. The way her laughter with him was sometimes followed by silence. The way she defended him less and less at family gatherings. And though it hurt him, he didn't blame her. He knew the pressure she was under. He knew the strength it took just to have chosen him in the first place. Still, the Whitmores gave him a name. They called him the useless son-in-law. The words stung not because they were true, but because of the cruelty behind them. They said it behind his back, but loud enough for him to hear. They mocked him when he wasn't in the room, but they made sure Emily heard it too. To them, David was nothing more than a burden, someone unworthy of their daughter, their niece, their kin. But David endured. He endured not because he was weak, but because he had chosen silence. He had chosen patience. He had chosen to hide the truth of who he really was, even if it meant being mocked. Because David knew something they didn't. He knew that the measure of a man is not in the titles given to him, but in the life he builds, the love he protects, and the truth he carries in silence. And though the Whitmores thought they had broken him, David's silence was not defeat. It was restraint. It was the patience of a storm waiting for its time. For one day the truth would come. And when it did, the Whitmores would see that the man they mocked was not the weakest among them, but the strongest. The Whitmore estate was more than just a home. It was a fortress of pride. Tall iron gates guarded sprawling gardens. Chandeliers glistened over marble floors, and every corner of the house seemed to whisper of wealth that had lasted generations. To outsiders, it was a picture of elegance and power. But for David, every step inside those walls felt like walking into a battlefield. Here, he was not a husband. He was not family. He was only the useless son-in-law. The name followed him like a shadow. At Sunday dinners, it would surface in the form of sly remarks. "Emily, dear, I still don't understand why you settled for this. You deserve someone who can actually take care of you. Or the most common one, spoken with a smirk and laughter. Our useless son-in-law is here. The words were daggers, sharp enough to cut, yet disguised as jokes so no one could call them cruel. David said nothing. He sat quietly, his eyes calm, his hands steady, as if the insults had no power over him. But inside he felt each one. Not for himself. He had long mastered the art of patience. But for Emily, who sat beside him, caught between the love she felt and the shame her family tried to force upon her. It was not just the elders who mocked him. The younger cousins, spoiled by wealth and blinded by arrogance, followed their parents' lead. They sneered at his clothes, made jokes about his lack of money, and compared him to their expensive cars, their designer suits, their lives of luxury. Emily tried, in the beginning, to silence them. She told them to stop. She defended David, saying love was worth more than wealth, that her husband was better than any of them because he was kind, patient, and real. But the more she defended him, the louder their laughter became. And little by little, her strength began to waver, because no matter how deep love runs, constant humiliation can wear it down. Soon, Emily herself began to see David through the lens of her family's judgment. She noticed the things she had once overlooked. The way his clothes weren't as fine, the way he drove an old car, the way he could not stand equal with the wealth around him. And though her heart still loved him, her mind began to whisper doubts planted by those around her. There were nights when she turned away from him, silent in bed, thinking of the life she could have had if she had listened to her family. There were mornings when her words were sharp, not out of hate, but out of frustration with the weight her family placed on her. David noticed. He noticed everything. But he did not blame her. He did not lash out, nor did he try to prove himself with flashy wealth. Instead, he held onto the quiet hope that the love they had built in the beginning would survive the storm. Because David knew what Emily did not, that he could change everything in a single moment. That with one word, one revelation, he could silence the voices that mocked him. But he chose not to. Not yet. For David understood something the Whitmores never would. Power revealed too soon loses its meaning. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. And his patience was not surrender, it was strategy. Still, every man has his limits. And every storm has its breaking point. For now, David bore the weight of being the useless son-in-law. But the day would come when those very words would turn into chains around the Whitmores' own necks. And when that day arrived, they would regret every whisper, every insult, every laugh they threw in his face. Every family has a pillar, someone whose voice carries more weight than anyone else's. In the Whitmore family, that pillar was Margaret Whitmore, Emily's grandmother. Margaret was a woman who had lived through wars, recessions, and decades of building an empire from the ground up. She wasn't just wealthy, she was powerful. Her decisions shaped the future of her family's business. Her influence stretched across boardrooms and political circles, and her approval was the crown everyone within the family fought to wear. She ruled not with kindness, but with authority. And in her eyes, David Carter was nothing but a blemish on the family name. Margaret had never hidden her disdain for him. From the very first introduction, she had looked him up and down, her cold blue eyes filled with judgment. She didn't need to ask about his job, his background, or his family. She had already decided he was beneath them. To Margaret, David was not only poor. He was an outsider who didn't deserve to sit at her table, let alone marry her granddaughter. The Whitmore family listened to her every word. Her sons, Robert and Charles, Emily's father and uncle, knew that her approval determined who would inherit the business and the fortune. Her grandchildren followed her like shadows, desperate for her attention, eager to prove themselves worthy. Emily, however, was never her favorite. While Emily was intelligent, hardworking, and determined, she was also independent. She questioned things. She thought for herself. And in Margaret's eyes, That independence was rebellion. Why reward a granddaughter who thought she knew better when she had others, Charles's children, who obeyed her without question? The contrast was painful. At family gatherings, Margaret showered her younger son's children with praise. "Brilliant," she would say. "Sharp, just like me." They were spoiled, reckless, and entitled, but to her, they were heirs worthy of the Whitmore name. And Emily? She was brushed aside. Her efforts at the company, her dedication, her ideas, they were dismissed, minimized, or, at times, outright stolen and credited to someone else. David saw it all. He saw how Emily worked late nights, how she poured her heart into the business, how her vision had saved deals and created opportunities. Yet, in meetings and gatherings, her grandmother credited the victories to others. And when David tried to point this out, when he tried to defend Emily, the Whitmores laughed. "What would you know about business?" they sneered. "You can't even afford to sit at this table." Margaret, in particular, was merciless. She called him dead weight, the kind of man who dragged his wife down instead of lifting her up. And each word she spoke became gospel for the rest of the family. But what Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that David was quietly pulling strings behind the scenes. Deals that appeared to come from nowhere, contracts that seemed impossible to secure, opportunities that fell into the company's lap. David had made them happen. Not for his own glory, but for Emily's. He wanted her to shine, to be seen, to be valued. And yet, even as Emily's achievements grew, the shadow of her grandmother loomed larger. Margaret had already decided who would be praised, who would inherit, and who would be cast aside. David's silence continued. His patience held. But deep within him, something was beginning to stir. He could endure the insults directed at him. He could endure being mocked and called useless. But to see Emily broken down, her hard work stolen, her spirit crushed by the very family that should have lifted her up, that was a wound he could not allow to bleed forever. And though Margaret Whitmore believed her power was unshakable, she had unknowingly set the stage for her own downfall. Because no empire, no matter how vast, can stand forever when it is built on arrogance and blindness. And when the moment came, Margaret would realize that the man she dismissed as nothing was the very storm that could sweep everything she built into dust. The Whitmore family loved to put their wealth on display. Charity galas, corporate banquets, award ceremonies. Their calendar was always filled with events where they could remind the world of their power and prestige. But none compared to the night of celebration. It was held once a year in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel, a towering building with golden chandeliers, velvet carpets, and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had built the family's empire. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, everyone who was anyone in New York attended. This year's celebration was more important than ever. The Whitmore Company had just secured the biggest contract in its history, a partnership that promised to expand their empire beyond anything they had ever imagined. To the family, this night was a coronation, a chance to boast, to bask in glory, and to elevate one of their own as the shining star. Margaret Whitmore, with her diamond necklace glistening and her cane tapping the marble floor, stood at the center of it all. Her pride was evident as she prepared to announce the one she believed deserved all the credit. But David knew the truth. The contract that saved the company, the deal that made this night possible, was not won by the Whitmore's spoiled heirs. It wasn't Margaret's genius, nor her favorite grandson's brilliance. It was Emily. And behind Emily, it was him. He had made the silent phone calls, pulled the hidden strings, opened doors that the Whitmores couldn't have unlocked in a lifetime. He had given his wife the tools, and she had used them with her intelligence and hard work to make the deal succeed. Together, they had done what the rest of the family never could. But no one else knew, and Margaret was about to erase Emily from her own victory. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as Margaret took the stage. Her voice, sharp and commanding, filled the ballroom. "Tonight, we celebrate the greatness of the Whitmore family. And this achievement, this contract that will define our future, was won by none other than... She paused, letting the suspense rise. My grandson, Charles Jr. Applause thundered through the hall. Guests rose to their feet, cheering for the young man who had done nothing but carry the Whitmore name. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and Margaret's smile widened as she looked upon her chosen heir. At a table in the corner, David clenched his fists. Beside him, Emily sat frozen, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She knew the truth, yet her grandmother had just erased her in front of hundreds of people. David's patience, which had carried him through endless insults, began to tremble. His voice, calm but firm, rose above the applause. With all due respect, he said, standing slowly, that credit does not belong to Charles Jr. The room went silent. Heads turned, eyes fixed on him, the useless son-in-law daring to speak during Margaret's grand moment. It was Emily, David continued. She was the one who worked day and night. She was the one who closed the deal. Without her, there would be no contract. And without her, there would be no celebration tonight. For a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. And then laughter erupted. From the Whitmore's table came mocking chuckles, sneers disguised as amusement. Margaret's eyes narrowed, cold as ice. How dare you? She hissed into the microphone, her voice echoing across the hall. How dare you embarrass this family with your delusions? Others joined in, their voices sharp. Sit down, David. Always speaking out of turn. Useless son-in-law trying to grab attention again. The humiliation was sharp, public, and merciless. Guests whispered, some laughing openly, others shaking their heads in pity. Emily's hand trembled on the table, caught between shame and fury. She wanted to defend him, but the voices of her family pressed down like chains. David looked around the hall, his jaw tight, his eyes steady. For the first time, his calm began to crack. He could endure their insults. He could endure their mockery. But not this, not the erasure of his wife's worth, not the cruelty of watching her achievements stolen before her very eyes. For the first time, David's silence felt dangerous. And though the Whitmores laughed at him that night, they would remember this moment forever. Because this was the night when their pride went too far. The night when the storm inside David Carter began to rise. The laughter still echoed in Emily's ears long after the applause had faded. Her grandmother's cold dismissal, her family's mocking voices, the crowd's whispers. It was more than she could bear. For years, she had watched David sit in silence while the Whitmores branded him as useless. For years, she had turned away from the sharpness of her family's words, telling herself that love could outlast humiliation. But that night, watching her husband stand for her, only to be torn down in front of hundreds, something inside Emily broke. Her hands trembled as she rose from her chair. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations. It all seemed to fade. With her heart pounding, she stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the ballroom. Enough! The word cut through the noise like a blade. Heads turned. The Whitmores froze in their seats. Margaret's eyes narrowed, sharp with disbelief. Emily's voice shook, but her resolve held. You call him useless, she said, her gaze sweeping over her family. You mock him, humiliate him, treat him like he doesn't belong. But the truth is, David has shown me more strength, more loyalty, and more love than anyone in this family ever has. A ripple of gasps spread across the room. Her uncles exchanged glances, her cousins whispered furiously, but Emily pressed on. You want to know why our company is standing tonight? Why that contract was signed? It wasn't because of Charles Jr., it wasn't because of grandmother's brilliance. It was because of David, because of the man you call useless. He was the reason the doors opened, the reason I could do my work, the reason we succeeded. The ballroom grew tense. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked at Emily with admiration, others with pity. But among the Whitmores, the reaction was venom. Margaret's cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. "How dare you, Emily?" she thundered. "How dare you stand here and disgrace this family for the sake of a man who has brought you nothing but shame?" Her father's voice followed, stern and cold. "You've allowed him to manipulate you, to blind you with false promises. If it weren't for your foolish marriage, this family would not be mocked tonight." And then her cousins joined in, piling words upon words, each one heavier than the last. "This is exactly why we said he was no good. You've ruined us, Emily. You've ruined everything. If not for him, you'd still be respected in this family." Emily's heart clenched. The people who had raised her, the family she had tried to honor all her life, now turned on her as though she were the enemy. Their anger was not just at David. It was at her, for choosing him, for standing beside him, for daring to love against their will. She felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood tall, her voice trembling but clear. "I don't regret marrying him," she whispered. "Not for a single moment. And if you can't see the man he truly is, then maybe it isn't him who doesn't belong in this family. Maybe it's all of you." The words hung in the air like fire. Margaret's face hardened, her pride too great to allow such defiance. "Then leave," she spat. "If you choose him, then you are no Whitmore. You are nothing." The finality of the sentence crushed the air from the room. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. David moved to Emily's side, his hand gently resting on hers. For the first time that night, his calm voice cut through the storm. "You've said enough." The Whitmores scoffed, shaking their heads, their laughter beginning again as if his words were nothing. But behind David's steady eyes was something none of them recognized. Something dangerous, something final. Because while Emily's breaking point had brought her to defend her husband, David's breaking point was still to come. And when it came, the Whitmores would understand what true power looked like. The ballroom still hummed with tension. Margaret's decree hung in the air like a blade. Emily was no longer a Whitmore. She was nothing. And David, standing silently beside her, was once again branded as useless, powerless, a burden unworthy of respect. The Whitmores laughed, confident in their authority. Guests murmured, some uncomfortable, others entertained by the spectacle of a powerful family humiliating their own. To them, David was just a man who had reached above his station and was swatted down for it. But David Carter had reached his breaking point. For too long, he had endured their mockery. For too long, he had hidden his truth to protect the purity of his love. But now, seeing his wife torn apart by the very people who should have cherished her, David knew the time for silence was over. He leaned close to Emily, his voice calm, steady. "Don't be afraid. They won't laugh much longer." Emily looked up at him, confusion in her tear-filled eyes. But before she could speak, David stepped aside and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through a list of contacts, and pressed a single number. The call was brief, no more than a few words spoken quietly, and then he ended it. First, nothing happened. The Whitmores smirked, whispering among themselves. "Calling his friends, is he?" One cousin sneered. "Maybe he'll order us pizza," another joked. But within minutes, the atmosphere shifted. Phones began to buzz at tables across the hall. First one, then another, then dozens. Guests frowned, scrolling through their screens, whispering urgently to each other. A ripple of unease spread like wildfire. Then came the first shout. "The Whitmore contract. It's been canceled." Another voice echoed from the back. "The company's shares are crashing." Gasps spread through the ballroom as more and more people confirmed the news. The very contract Margaret had celebrated, the one that secured their empire's future, was gone. Their victory had turned to ashes in the span of minutes. Margaret slammed her cane on the stage, her voice trembling with rage. "What nonsense is this?" But before she could continue, the doors of the ballroom swung open. A hush fell over the room as a man strode inside. A man every business leader in the state recognized instantly. It was the CEO of the international firm the Whitmores had signed their deal with. His presence should have been a triumph for the family, a sign of their importance. But his eyes did not seek Margaret, or Charles Jr., or any other Whitmore. Instead, he walked straight past them all and stopped in front of David Carter. And then he bowed. Gasps filled the room. The Whitmores froze in disbelief as the powerful CEO bent his head in respect to the man they had called useless. "Mr. Carter," the CEO said, his voice carrying across the hall, "forgive the disturbance. I came personally to deliver this." He handed David a leather-bound folder, his posture deferential, his tone reverent. David accepted it calmly, his expression unreadable. Around him, the Whitmores' eyes widened, their laughter gone, their arrogance replaced with confusion and fear. Margaret's voice finally broke through the silence, weak and trembling. What is the meaning of this?" The CEO turned to her, his face composed but firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, surely you must know. The man you call your son-in-law is not who you think he is. He is the owner of one of the largest conglomerates in this country. Every deal we've made, every door you thought you opened was because of him. Without David Carter, your company would have collapsed years ago." The room erupted into whispers, gasps, disbelief. Guests stared at David with wide eyes, some in awe, others in shock. Margaret stumbled back, her hand gripping her cane. Her sons stared at each other, their faces pale. Charles Jr., once smiling proudly on stage, now looked as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. And Emily's heart pounded as realization crashed over her. The man she had defended, the man she had doubted, the man she had loved despite the world's scorn, was not just strong. He was powerful beyond anything she could have imagined. David finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, but carrying the weight of thunder. "You called me useless. You mocked me. You humiliated my wife, the only one among you who has ever worked with honesty and loyalty. Tonight you see the truth. The man you dismissed is the one who held your empire together. And the family you thought untouchable now stands on the edge of ruin, by my choice." His words rang through the hall, undeniable, unshakable. And in that moment the Whitmores understood. The storm they had mocked was now standing before them, unmasked. The ballroom was silent. Not a single guest dared to breathe too loudly as David Carter stood revealed before the Whitmores. The man they had mocked, crushed, and ridiculed now unveiled as the true giant among them. Margaret's face had drained of color. Her knuckles turned white around her cane as her entire empire crumbled before her eyes. Charles Jr. staggered back a step, his once proud smirk twisted into disbelief. And the cousins who had laughed the loudest now looked at David with fear. Emily's chest tightened as she looked at her husband. The man she thought she knew, the man she had once feared was too small to stand beside her, was standing taller than she had ever seen him. Power radiated from him, not from arrogance, but from truth. David's eyes scanned the room, calm, unshaken. He held the folder the CEO had handed him, then opened it with deliberate grace. Inside were documents, legal papers, contracts, transfers of ownership. The future of the Whitmores written in black and white. He turned to Margaret. "Do you remember the properties you lost years ago? The debts you could not pay, the bankruptcy you swept under the rug?" Margaret's lips trembled, but she did not answer. David continued, his voice firm. "My company bought all of it. The very ground beneath your mansion, the very business you boast about. Without my mercy, you would have been beggars long ago." Gasps echoed across the hall. Guests looked at Margaret with wide, scandalized eyes. Her secret downfall now exposed. David closed the folder and handed it. Not to Margaret, not to Charles Jr., but to Emily. "This is yours," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers. "Everything they once used to control you, to shame you, now belongs to you. My gift, not of pity, but of love. Because you believed in me when no one else did." Emily's hands shook as she took the folder. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming tide of emotions crashing inside her. Margaret's voice finally broke, desperate, sharp. You dare give her my legacy?" David turned to her, his eyes colder than steel. "No, Margaret, that was never your legacy. You built nothing but arrogance and cruelty. The true legacy, the loyalty, the hard work, the resilience, belongs to Emily. And now so does everything else." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests clapped softly, others whispered in awe, but no one defended the Whitmores. Their empire was gone. Their pride was shattered. Charles Jr. dropped his glass, the sound shattering against the floor. This can't be real," he muttered, his voice trembling. David finally looked at the family as a whole, men and women who had once sneered at him, dismissed him as worthless. "You thought I was useless. You thought I was beneath you. Tonight you see the truth. The only disgrace in this room is not me. It's you. Every word of mockery, every act of cruelty, every humiliation. You will live with it, while my wife and I walk forward, stronger than ever." Emily could no longer hold back. She threw her arms around David, her tears falling freely, her voice breaking with love. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for doubting you, for letting their words touch my heart. I love you, David, not because of this, not because of power, but because you are the only man who ever truly loved me." David held her tightly, his eyes softening, his mask of steel melting into warmth. "And I love you, Emily. That's why I hid who I was, because I needed to know that you loved me for me, not for my name." The ballroom erupted, not with mockery, not with whispers, but with applause. Genuine, thunderous applause. Guests stood, some wiping their eyes, others nodding in respect. The Whitmores, broken and defeated, stood frozen in their shame. Margaret sank into a chair, her empire gone, her pride destroyed. But David and Emily stood tall together, side by side, stronger than ever before. For the world, it was a scandal, a revelation, a story that would ripple through every corner of society. But for Emily, it was something far simpler, far purer. Her husband, her love, her partner, unmasked at last. And in that moment, she knew the sweetest revenge was not their downfall. It was their love, unbroken, unshakable, eternal.